Imagine that you've moved to a state on the East Coast. It can be a lot colder there, especially in the winter. How would you adapt to your new environment? Would you buy a new wardrobe? Would you turn on the heating a lot more often? Would you try to be outside a lot less? There's a lot of things that you could do. But even if you do those things, how long do you think it would take before you were fully adapted to that new environment and feel like it's your normal environment the same way you do living in your current home state? Well, it might take you a while, but eventually I promise you would be able to adapt. It would become your new normal. It would just take some time. Animals, plants, any living organism also can adapt to new environment, new situations, just like you can. But unlike humans, it can take them much more time, and it has a lot less to do with things like planning ahead and thinking about how you can adapt. It kind of happens a little more naturally, but a little more slowly. So natural selection was originally developed by a man named Charles Darwin, who in 1831 embarked on a 5-year voyage aboard the HMS Beagle. His goal was to collect and study plant and animal specimens, like the finches you see in the picture on screen, that he encountered on this trip along the South American coastline and a few other stops throughout the world. Darwin's observations of how these different finches are similar and different is how he developed the idea of evolution, that living organisms change over time, or entire populations of those organisms can change over time. And why do they do that? What is the purpose? Why don't they just stay the same? If it's working now, if you're able to survive now, why would you need to change? How would you change if you did? So what natural selection is it's the process by which organisms, all living organisms with variation that is most suited to their local environment, are able to survive and leave more offspring. Obviously, all living things need to survive if they're going to continue, but the species will die if they can't also make babies. That's what leaving offspring is, having babies, be able to continue on your race, whether it's human, monkey, bee, tree. All living organisms are affected by this idea, this process of natural selection. And there are 4 principles of natural selection that this video is going to review. That is overproduction, adaptation, variation, and finally, descent with modification. The first principle I want to talk about is overproduction. Overproduction is when more offspring, that's babies, are produced than can survive in any given environment, because that creates competition or a struggle for resources between animals, both of the same species, and between other species. So while I did say that it is important for organisms to make more of themselves, if they make too many more of themselves and those cells continue to survive, they're going to be competing for food and shelter and all the things that an organism needs to survive, but there won't be enough to go around because those resources don't increase as the population increases. So if the population gets too big, that's overproduction, then many of them will start to die out because there's not enough to go around. The other principle I want to talk about is variation. Variation is the heritable differences that exist in every population caused by different genetics. So all the traits and all the genetics of an entire population of organisms being passed down to the next generation of offspring for the entire society. So in the past, we kind of talked about just individual families. Now we're kind of looking at like the group of all the genetic traits of an entire population of humans, an entire population of giraffes, and what are all the traits being passed down to all the offsprings of each generation. Because variation creates adaptation. And adaptation is what makes certain organisms better fit to survive and reproduce. It also explains why some species are never seen at all. That's why you'll never see a giraffe with a short neck. Is it possible that a giraffe with a short neck can be born? Yes, but if that happened, it would die because it wouldn't be able to reach the food it needs to survive. So it doesn't meet one of the criteria of natural selection, which is being able to survive. And if you're not able to survive, you're obviously not going to make the second criteria, which is make babies, because you can't make babies if you died at a very young age. So that's what makes variation so important, is because that allows for adaptation so that each generation of an organism has the traits it needs to continue to survive and create offspring, babies. And variation is caused by two factors that you've studied already in the class. One is meiosis and sexual reproduction. They actually go together, if you remember from your notes and your performance task. And also mutations, because while we studied mostly harmful mutations, it is possible that a mutation could happen, that messed up genetic code that actually leads to a good mutation, something that makes you stronger or tougher or more able to find food better than you were able to do before, or just makes it easier to have offspring, because humans don't have that much trouble making babies, not as a population, but there are some species where sometimes that can become a challenge, and a random mutation could actually help them do that better. It's kind of a luck factor, but that is something that can cause variation in a good way. Another important principle of natural selection is adaptation. Adaptation is the fact that certain traits give individuals the advantage of surviving in their local environment and are able to reproduce and pass on their traits to the next generation. So if you look at this picture right here, the advantageous trait that a giraffe needs is that long neck. Without that long neck, he can't reach the food that's really high up in the air. So that's why this one would starve and die, just like I was explaining in the last slide. And that's adaptation, an entire population maintaining and keeping or learning new traits that allow the population to continue to survive and reproduce, and losing or seeing the traits that don't help that happen or actually go against survival start to disappear as the individuals with those traits die out. The final principle of natural selection is descent with modification, and you're going to be getting into this a lot deeper in a later activity. But for now, what you need to know about descent with modification is that the more individuals in each generation that have these heritable adaptations, these good ones, they'll be passing them down, and as they do, they'll become more frequent. You'll find them more often. So if we look at the image down here, imagine these white traits here are not great traits, but this brown one is really good, but maybe it just hasn't shown up very much. Maybe it's a mutation. Maybe it's a recessive gene, so it just doesn't show up as often as the dominant. But what if through natural selection, it turns out this dominant white gene is not good? Maybe it actually is harder to survive with that gene for the white shell. And that means this brown shell, well, as it survives and makes more babies, and the white one starts to die out and therefore not makes more babies, well, this either mutation or recessive gene starts to take over. And if that continues on generation to generation, eventually you'll have a society of snails that's all brown. Traits that don't help it to survive are going to disappear. They're either going to die out or look less attractive to mates and not be able to make more babies, and the strong one will survive. And the reason why the strong are considered strong is not necessarily because they're just inherently tougher or smarter, it's because they have those advantageous traits. And finally, here's a few terms to help you out when you're writing your essay that describes some of the things we've been talking about. This is some useful vocabulary. One of those terms is gene pool. A gene pool consists of all the genes in a population. So in the past, we've talked about the chromosomes in each individual and how they get passed down. Well, when we talk about an entire population, like all the humans living in a city or all the humans living in a state or an entire country or the world even, we're talking about the gene pool, the collection of all the traits that maybe every individual doesn't have, but if we add them all together, we have the gene pool. And then scientists will also use the term allele frequency to count the number of times that an allele, a trait, occurs in a gene pool. Because there will be some alleles we don't see very often. And there will be some alleles we see very often, some traits that we see very often. So how rare or common any given trait, whether it's hair color, eye color, potential strength, endurance, resistance to disease, all these things. There's a number to how often they show up, and that's allele frequency. Increases in allele frequency result in larger percentage of the population carrying that allele from generation to generation, because the more people that have any given trait, any given allele, the more likely are that they are going to have kids and pass that trait on. And as those kids have kids, that allele's frequency goes up over time, as shown in this chart. Whereas this allele right here, this is one that at one point was not seen as much as the trait right here that seems to increase over time. And on top of that, seems to not be a very useful or not very desirable trait. So it's starting to disappear because for whatever reason, these individuals just aren't having many babies, either because they're dying out or they're just not very attractive to mates. Something is happening that causes that trait to not show up very often. But either way, as a trait increases in frequency or decreases in frequency, either one is evolution. Evolution isn't just about adding new traits, it's also about weeding out old traits that are no longer necessary or even harmful. And that's it. If you have any questions about natural selection or any of the terms you heard in this video, please let me know in class, and thank you for viewing.
Life too unpredictable, take control of